So, my new book will be published by Routledge in April of this year, 2018. It's called Psychoanalytic Thinking, a Dialectical Critique of Contemporary Theory and Practice. How does it differ from the previous book, The Still Small Voice, published in 2013? Well, the latter was focused very much on issues of guilt and conscience, focused on guilt evasion, the use of guilt substitutes, self-punishment, self-sabotage, self-limitation, clutching defeat from the jaws of victory, what Freud called moral masochism. Psychoanalysts had been studying narcissism for some 4 decades, and ironically, at the same time as they were studying narcissism, they were forgetting about guilt. And that's ironic because the narcissist wants to forget about guilt. I mean, the last thing a narcissist wants to face is his guilt. So here we were studying narcissism while forgetting about guilt, and therefore not understanding, in my opinion, not understanding the dynamics of narcissism. Psychoanalysis was in flight from the superego, and the narcissist is in flight from the superego. The narcissist hates regulation, rules, and limits. And of course, according to Christopher Lasch, we've been living for some time in a culture of narcissism, the culture produced by advanced consumer capitalism, and the culture of narcissism, like the narcissist that it produces, hates rules, hates regulation. It's all about deregulation, neoliberalism. So there's an irony there. There's been a comeback recently in the last 10 years or so. Psychoanalysts have started to remember guilt, have started to remember the superego. And of course, in that book, I make a plea for them to not just remember superego, but also to remember the conscience, which is, in my view, a function quite separate from superego, a function that Freud decided in 1923 to fold into superego. I think this was a mistake because it made it very difficult for us to recognize conflicts between conscience and superego. So I was arguing for a reversal of that decision, to recognize conscience as a separate mental function. The conscience, in my view, generating a very different kind of guilt than that which is generated by the superego. And part of the problem here was that Freud had failed to recognize this distinction between two kinds of guilt that Melanie Klein and her colleagues did recognize. Persecutory guilt on the one hand, which I believe is inflicted by the superego, versus reparative guilt, which is generated by conscience. Superego generates self-punishment, persecutory guilt, and persecutory anxiety. Conscience generates what Winnicott helpfully calls the capacity for concern, which is his term to describe what Melanie Klein called what she meant by depressive anxiety. Depressive anxiety reflecting concern for the other, persecutory anxiety and persecutory guilt being all about the self. So that was really the argument of the first book, the idea that the persecutory guilt generated by the superego is all about hate, turned around and reflected against the self, whereas conscience arises from early loving experiences, nurturing experiences, receiving love and loving the nurturer. Two very different origins of two very different kinds of guilt and responsibility. So I return in chapter 1 of the present book to these issues And I expand a bit in that in 1923, when he folded conscience into superego, Freud also folded ego-ideal into superego. And just therefore, as we lost the capacity to study conflicts between conscience and the other structures, so we lost the ability to study conflicts between the ego-ideal and the other structures. So I'm calling for the recognition of 5 structures: id, ego, superego, ego-ideal, and conscience, and for systematic study of the conflicts within each of the 5 structures, as well as among the 5 structures. So looking first of all at the intra-system conflicts within the id between love and hate, within the ego by differing identifications, say between masculine and feminine identifications, conflicts within the superego between different and sometimes quite incompatible moral systems, say the morals of the old country versus the morals of the new country, conflicts within the ego-ideal between incompatible ideals. For example, a commitment to truth-telling is often rather incompatible with a commitment to being kind. And then conflicts within the conscience between competing loyalties or competing attachments. In addition to those intra-system conflicts, there are the inter-system conflicts. When we add these all up and remove the overlapping categories, we find 15 conflicts, and analysts have only studied perhaps half of these. It's been difficult to study the others because we haven't had the concepts with which to do so, so that we haven't really studied conflicts between the ego-ideal and the conscience, or the ego-ideal and the superego, or the ego-ideal and the ego, or the conscience and the id, or the conscience and the superego, or the conscience and the ego. 15 conflicts altogether, which require more systematic study. So that's chapter 1 of the new book. In the rest of the book, I'm focusing critically on particular theorists, starting with Freud and the argument of his civilization and its discontents. And I do something of a Kleinian critique of Freud's thinking in that chapter. I then go on to talk about self and relational and intersubjective psychoanalysis, looking at that critically from Freudian and Kleinian points of view, while also appreciating what I see as its valid contributions. There's a chapter on Lacan. That chapter is based on a paper I originally gave to the Toronto Psychoanalytic Society back in about 1984 or 1987, I think it was. I was ambivalent then about Lacan, and I'm ambivalent about him now, although I think I am somewhat more appreciative now than I was in the past, particularly because I came to have a deepened awareness of how Lacan has moved psychoanalysis back into congruence with Judeo-Christianity. Not the religion, but Judeo-Christian philosophy, particularly its philosophical anthropology, particularly its understanding of the human problem. Freud, unfortunately, saw the human problem as a mind-body problem, as a human versus animal problem, as a culture versus nature problem. Yes, it's true he didn't use the German word instinct for animal instinct. He used the German word Trieb, meaning drive. But he insisted that the drives bubble up from a bodily source, that they have their roots in a somatic source, by which he did not mean the brain, but bodily zones. And this is pretty profoundly incorrect. He was honest enough to admit that he couldn't identify the bodily source of the aggressive drive, which should have caused him to question the whole concept of bodily sources. human sexuality and aggression trickle down from the symboling mind and employ the body as a vehicle rather than bubbling up from the body. And so the human problem is not a mind-body problem. It's a uniquely human problem. It's the conflict in the human heart and mind between love on the one hand and hate on the other, life and death, constructiveness and destructiveness. Freud, of course, in 1920 had identified in his final dual drive theory the forces of love and life, eros versus thanatos, but he never fully rethought his vision in this light. Melanie Klein picked up on that in a way that his daughter Anna Freud did not, and resituated psychoanalysis not as a mind-body issue, but a love-hate, life-death conflict, as did Erich Fromm, who had a profound understanding of the human being as a denatured animal. He describes us as freaks of nature, rooted in nature by our bodies, yet radically transcending nature in a way no other animal species does, through our relative freedom from instinctual determination and our capacity for choice, and therefore responsibility, and therefore guilt and self-consciousness. Lacan deepens this analysis by really focusing on the problem of narcissism, not as a pathological condition, but as the human condition, that our narcissism is existential, that we flee from a sense of originary fragmentation into this idolatrous worship of the ego image. And of course this is profoundly Catholic, profoundly Christian. The fundamental problem is the sin of pride or self-centeredness. For Lacan, the whole problem is that we become rather addicted to ourselves, to our self-images, and we worship this image. And the solution, of course, for Lacan is a radical decentering, which he calls acceptance of castration, by which he really means acceptance of crucifixion, that is, a willingness to go to the cross, that is, a willingness to surrender our self-centered omnipotence and to face the fact of our brokenness. One need not be a religious person to accept this. Lacan was an atheist, but he was a Roman Catholic atheist. The novelist Graham Greene described himself as a Roman Catholic atheist. I'm a Christian atheist. A lot of people would like to recruit Lacan as an advocate, a defender of the religion, which is a real misrepresentation of Lacan, because he said quite clearly that the victory of religion would be the death of psychoanalysis. So he was an atheistic thinker, but his thinking was profoundly in sync with Roman Catholic philosophy and philosophical anthropology, and it understands that the human being lives not just in the geosphere and the biosphere, but profoundly in the noosphere. And here, Erich Fromm grasps this point extremely clearly as well. So all of this I find of value. I hate Lacan's obscurantism. I hate the sadism that causes him to torture his readers and make them feel stupid by saying in 40, at times incoherent pages, what he could say clearly in 4 pages. He's grandiose and obscurantist, and this is unacceptable, but at the same time he gives us some profound understandings that are hard to find elsewhere. in the psychoanalytic literature, and for this I have to appreciate him. I go on to both appreciate Wilfred Bion and also critique aspects of his work. I'm profoundly in agreement with Bion's idea that the mind needs truth the way a plant needs water, and that the properly functioning mind evolves towards the truth by learning how to think on increasingly advanced levels, which lead closer and closer to an ultimately incompletely knowable truth. But the truth is often painful, and very often people find it unbearable and choose not to bear it, and therefore instead of developing their minds progressively, they regress. There is a devolution rather than an evolution, and Bion is really a student of the resistance, the ways the mind seeks to evade truth and resist truth. So in all of this, I'm in complete agreement with Bion. But I think he gets a number of things backwards. He associates the depressive position with depression, which is a mistake. There's never depression in the depressive position. What Melanie Klein meant by calling it depressive was that this is where we encounter depressive anxiety, not depression, but depressive anxiety, which is my fear that I have gone and damaged my good objects. Helpfully, Winnicott renames depressive anxiety the capacity for concern. So the depressive position is about concern, not about depression. Depression is a paranoid schizoid phenomenon, because to be depressed requires splitting. It requires feeling that I'm all bad. I mean, if I can remember my goodness, in addition to my badness, I'm not depressed. I may be sad, I may be guilty, I may be regretful, but I'm not depressed because I'm not splitting. Bion, and again Britton, in following Bion makes, I think, another mistake. Bion associates the paranoid schizoid position with fragmentation and the depressive position with order, when I think it's the other way around. It's as if he and Britton have forgotten that the paranoid schizoid position is characterized by the rigid order brought about by splitting. Everything is either all good or all bad. Everything is totalized. This is where totalitarianism lies. This is where fundamentalism, both in religion and in politics, lies. The order imposed by splitting, which, if we're going to progress, needs to be overcome as we move into D, where we begin to find not order, but to begin to be able to tolerate disorder, where we find not certainty, but a growing capacity to tolerate uncertainty. So I have no problem with Bion and Britton's idea that creativity involves the relaxation of rigid order and the toleration of fragmentation in order to create the possibility of advance into a new order. That cycling is absolutely correct, but I just think they have it backwards in describing this as a relaxation of the order of D in favor of the fragmentation of PS, when in fact order lies in PS and the toleration of uncertainty lies in D. Okay, so that's a critique and at the same time an appreciation of Bion's thought. I go on to do a chapter on Winnicott, a chapter on Fromm, a chapter on the psychoanalytic anthropologist Ernest Becker, a chapter on Heinrich Racker's concepts of countertransference. Who have I left out? I think that pretty well covers it. The constant Theme is dialectical thinking. I think the default position of the mind is paranoid schizoid splitting, either or, and we need to get beyond this towards the ultimately unattainable or incompletely attainable synthesis. And we do this by identifying the polar opposites that are at play in any discourse, and then seeking to deconstruct the privileging of one, and not just lurching then to the opposite, but deconstructing the privileging of that as well, in order to be able to move on towards a third thing, a third area where a synthesis begins to emerge that both preserves, negates, preserves, and elevates these polarities. And then, of course, that synthesis itself becomes the thesis, giving rise to another antithesis, moving on towards the ever-evolving synthesis. I don't believe in a final synthesis, but I rather believe in an evolving, spiraling process that is possible, but we get stuck and we regress. And psychoanalysis as a therapy is an attempt to get the progressive movement going once again, precisely by getting ourselves free from thesis and then free from antithesis, so that we can move on to the synthesis. Dialectical thinking. The new book is really a plea for this and an attempt to illustrate how this works. And it's also a plea for psychoanalysts to come out of their silos. For a long time, Kleinians have talked to Kleinians, and Freudians to Freudians, and self-psychologists to self-psychologists, and Lacanians to Lacanians. It's time that we talk to one another. I mean, it's ridiculous, this implicit norm that you can't talk about paranoid, schizoid, and depressive positions unless you're a Kleinian. You can't talk about the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real unless you're a Lacanian. I'm not advocating a simple eclecticism, a kind of theoretical stew, not at all. I'm talking about a critical comparison of concepts whereby we can come to really see where we overlap and where we really do differ, and try to achieve a critical integration of these concepts, because all of the schools have glimpsed something. All of the schools have glimpsed a part of the truth, and we need to move on to a more holistic vision. And I think a dialectically deconstructive method is the way to begin to achieve this. So that's really what the book is about. Thanks.